24/7 World Radio.
There, John Fells back with the broadcast here. And we're going to begin a series of book readings, concerning the war between the states, because this is the foundation for all the corruption of that history, is the foundation for all the socialist communism, all the pro-black, anti-white socialist communism that's come as a result of the misinformation and the deliberate twisting of that history, so that the white men of the South are portrayed as a bunch of Nazis, as a bunch of KKKers that all hated black people and that are responsible for the horrible, terrible plight of the blacks in the South, and it goes on and on and on. So this purpose, one of the purposes in to read this book to you, is to show you that's not the case. That the reason why the blacks have suffered after the war between the states is primarily because of white, northern, radical red Republican policies that later morphed into the Democratic Party, and that we shall see that the war was not fought to keep the black man as a slave. It was fought to prevent the centralization of power in the North. That's why the Southerners fought. They didn't fight to preserve slave trade. They were already emancipating their slaves and gradually sending them back to Liberia, to Africa, as I have stated many times previously on this broadcast, and recognizing that, as the Jefferson said, both nations, both peoples equally free cannot live under the same government. They were beginning to gradually emancipate blacks and then enabling them to return to their native land, which was Africa, so that they could have a nation there. Of course, Africa having been given to the sons of Ham, which were black. And the only white men that were ever really allowed to live in Africa that brought blessing to the blacks there were the Boers, were the white Protestants who went into South Africa and ultimately Rhodesia and the Transvaal and the Orange Free State and those other places, seeking deliverance from the holy office of the Inquisition in Europe, and that's why they settled the place. If there had been no white power structure run by the Pope, murdering and killing off Protestants, there wouldn't be any white men in Africa today, in South Africa and in Rhodesia. So you black men need to turn your head and look at the papacy as the source as to why these white men ultimately came to Africa, which indeed brought blessing to you, brought law, brought culture, brought prosperity, brought diamond mines, brought platinum mines. But as I teach, it's best that we racially separate into nationhood, and so you need to know the whole agitation and where it comes from. And this is why I'll be having a special private citizenship class with only blacks in Philadelphia coming up, and they want to have a private meeting. I said, that's fine. I said, I want you to know exactly what's been done to you and your people, whether you want to call yourself a person of color or black or whatever. And so that you know the white power structure has done this to you and what you can do about it, the right thing to do about it. So part of this is learning why the white men of the South, those Democrats of the South, fought so hard in the Great Civil War. And that the father of American Marxism is a man named Joseph Wiedemeyer, pioneer of American socialism, written by Karl Obermann. And this was a Yankee general in the Yankee Union Army, and he was taught by Karl Marx in the 1800s. Came over here along with 8 other Marxian socialists, were made Yankee Union generals. And so these communist generals were busy decimating the white Protestant South, because communism, socialism, hates Protestantism, hates the Bible, hates any sort of freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Because under communism, you don't have freedom of the press or freedom of the speech. So I'll get into that book from time to time, but I'll be reading to you a book titled A Youth's History of the Great Civil War in the United States from 1861 to 1865 by R.G. Horton with illustrations. And it's out of New York. The publisher's Van Every, V-A-N, then Every, E-V-R-I-E, comma, Horton and Company, 162 Nassau Street, and printed in 1867. This is 2 years after the war. So you would call this, if you're doing research, you would call this a primary document. It was written by men who had lived through the era, and so they were eyewitnesses of what took place. It's written by Northern Democrats that are called Copperheads, that sided with the Southern Democrats. But so that you know that this book is a classic and you should have your children know it, I'll be reading it to you. So we start out. To the reader, this book has been written in the cause of truth, capital T. It has not been the object of the writer to defend any particular party or faction, but solely to vindicate democratic and republican institutions. There have in all ages been really but two parties in politics. One that did not believe in the people, but wanted a strong, in italics, government to control or rule them, in italics. The other that believed in the people was for retaining power in their hands to control or rule, in italics, the government. The former is the monarchical or strong government party. Its members were called Tories in the Revolution of 1776. The latter is the Democratic Party. I shall show in this history how these parties originated in this country and who led them. That Alexander Hamilton was the leader of the Tory or monarchical party and Thomas Jefferson of the Democratic Party. I shall show that this Tory party has always been trying to subvert our government because it was formed on the democratic principle, because the government was formed on the democratic principle. I shall show that finally, after being defeated in every other effort, this Tory party assumed the name of Republican and, taking advantage of a popular delusion about Negroes, used it to get into power and accomplish its long-cherished purpose. I shall show that Abraham Lincoln was the direct successor of old John Adams and his infamous alien and sedition laws, only that Mr. Lincoln went much further, and acted much worse than John Adams ever dared to do. I shall show that the war was not waged, quote, to preserve the Union or to maintain Republican institutions, unquote, but really to destroy both, and that every dollar spent and every life lost have been taken by the abolitionists on false pretenses, in italics. This book will show that the abolition or so-called Republican Party has simply carried out the British free Negro policy on this continent, a pet measure of all the kings and despots of Europe. In order to reach this end, Mr. Lincoln was compelled to assume the dictatorship and overthrow the government as it was formed, which he did by issuing a military edict or decree changing the fundamental law of the land and declaring that he would maintain this change by all the military and naval power of the United States. It will also be seen that the war has changed the entire character and system of our government, overthrown the ancient rights of the states, and forced upon the country a so-called amendment, capital A, to the Constitution, capital C, in the time of war and against the free and unbiased action of the people. This book also contains a careful and impartial narrative of all the principal events of the war, from the Battle of Bull Run down to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and the capture of Jefferson Davis. The writer believes it will be found accurate in all respects, and in most cases the place and date of citation are given, so that no one can have a chance to deny their accuracy. The book is given to the Northern people under the confident belief that they did not intend to destroy their government by the war, and that they only need to understand the aims and objects of the Tory, monarchical, or abolition party to forever hold it responsible for all the sufferings of the country. To the soldiers of the Northern armies who were deluded by the abolitionists into believing that they were fighting to preserve Republican institutions, the political facts, in italics, of this volume are respectively commended. The Southern people who fought so long and so gallantly to roll back the tide of abolitionism, that's radical emancipation. Think of that. It's not gradual emancipation because the Southern states were already doing that. It was a radical emancipation that helped to destroy the Southern culture and also to destroy the blacks too, to drive them up north, to work for the white power structure, to treat them as less than mankind. The North had no love at all for the Southern black man. We cannot forget that. And that's exactly what Malcolm X said too, by the way. Going on. The Southern people who fought so long and so gallantly to roll back the tide of abolitionism that has engulfed them will, the writer trusts, find in this volume encouragement to believe that wrong, capital W, can only be temporarily successful, and that it only needs faith in the power of the press to yet overthrow the abolition revolutionists. Remember, the abolition revolutionists were communists. Marx said, the American Civil War, with the North invading the South, was America's communist revolution. Finally, to all classes, and especially to the young, this little volume is commended in the confident hope and behalf that out of the gloom of the present, this is 1867 that this is written, the grand old Union of Washington and Jefferson will yet arise, and wiping away the tears and blood of the past, live for ages to cheer mankind with its blessings. End of introduction, and we give all the chapters as they are described with certain lines, and we have a total of 48 chapters in this book, ending with the capture of Jefferson Davis. Chapter 1, the causes of the war. Many histories of the Great War through which we have just passed, that's 1861 to 65, have already been written, but they are not such as convey to the youth of our land a full and true account of the causes which led to it, who were the real authors of it, and what were its objects and purposes. To understand fully the causes which produced it, we must go back a good ways in the history of our country. Whatever produced a feeling of enmity and estrangement between the Southern and Northern states must be looked upon as one of the causes leading to the war. This feeling of hostility between the two sections began to show itself at a very early period, soon after the formation of the Union, almost 100 years ago. That would be 1767 in that particular phrase. We may say it began in the first place in the different political opinions held by the leading men of the North and the South. This difference was indeed very great, and may be understood by briefly reviewing the different sentiments entertained by Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton was the idol of what may be termed the New England or monarchical party. Remember, the Jesuits are always the monarchists. They want centralization of power. They don't want powers limited. So they were on the side of the monarchical power. So, New England or monarchical power party, and Jefferson was equally the idol of the Southern or Democratic Party. There were many individuals in the North who followed Jefferson, as there were some in the South who adopted the principles of Hamilton. But the prevailing sentiment of the North was with Hamilton, as that of the South was with Jefferson. Hamilton was a monarchist. That is, he wanted to establish in this country a government that should be, in everything but its name, a kingdom, in italics, instead of a republic. This was imposed upon us on March 9th, 1933 with FDR. This kingdom. There is abundant proof of this fact. Luther Martin, by the way, Luther Martin, I believe, was a Baptist. Luther Martin, one of the most distinguished statesmen in the convention that made our Constitution, speaking of the Hamilton party in that body said, quote, "There is one party whose object and wish was to abolish and annihilate all the state governments and bring forward one general government over all this extended continent of a monarchical nature." Unquote. Again, this happened on March 9th, 1933, here in this country. In many places in the letters and writings of Jefferson, we find that great statesman and pure patriot, alluding with just condemnation to these monarchical doctrines of Hamilton. He and Hamilton were in Washington's cabinet together, and 30 years afterwards, while calmly reviewing the opinions of Hamilton, he says, quote, "Hamilton was not only a monarchist, but for a monarchy bottomed on corruption," unquote. So we can thank God Alexander Hamilton was killed in a duel. In another place, he says, quote, "Hamilton declared openly that there was no stability, no security in any kind of government but a monarchy," unquote. Again, he assures us that even while Hamilton was in Washington's cabinet as Secretary of the Treasury, he declared, quote, "For my part, I avow myself a monarchist. I have no objection to a trial of this thing called a republic, but," unquote, etc., etc. Remember, Republican forms of government are born out of the Protestant Reformation. The first republic was the Republic of Geneva. And then the next one would be called the Dutch Republic, or the Republic of the United Netherlands, after which then the Republic of these United States was patterned after the Dutch Republic of the United Provinces of the Netherlands. These republics were born out of the Protestant Reformation and the Bible being in the hand of common men. And they didn't want a monarchical government anymore because they had lived under the tyranny of a Holy Roman Empire since about from 800 to the time of the American Revolution. The Protestants did not want the tyranny of the Holy Roman Empire or the Pope or the kings or King George, whatever. Getting the feel of this? At the date of August 13th, 1791, Mr. Hamilton had a conversation with Mr. Jefferson in which he said, quote, "I own it is my opinion. I own it is my opinion, though I do not publish it in Dan or Beersheba," that's from north to south, "that the present government is not that which will answer, and that it will be found expedient to go into the British form." That happened on March 9th, 1933, in this country. That is to become a monarchy. The president today is, in fact, a de facto king as of March 9th, 1933. This language was uttered by Hamilton 3 years after our present Constitution had been adopted. So it was adopted in 1789. 3 years later is there about 1791. He was then, as we have said, Secretary of the Treasury under President Washington. Washington, hearing from various sources that his secretary had avowed such shameless sentiments, wrote him a letter July 20th, 29th, 1792, asking for an explanation of these rumors. About a month after Hamilton received this letter, that is, on August 16th, he wrote a complaining kind of letter to Mr. Adams on the subject, in which he said, quote, "All the persons I meet are prosperous and happy, and yet most of them, including the friends of the government, i.e. of Washington's administration, appear to be much alarmed at a supposed system of policy tending to subvert the Republican government of this country," unquote. But not only the friends of Washington's administration were alarmed, but the alarm was shared by Washington himself. It was under the pressure of this very alarm for the honor of some members of his cabinet that Washington said, quote, "Those who lean to a monarchical government have either not consulted the public mind," because they were all Protestants and Baptists born out of the first Great Awakening there and didn't want any sort of absolutism in the country, "or they live in a region which is much more productive of monarchical ideas than is the case with the southern states," unquote. Washington, like Jefferson, was a Virginian and had no sympathy with the monarchical principles of Hamilton and his followers. Washington well intimates that these treasonous principles had no friends, quote, in the southern states, unquote. The statesmen of the South, with scarcely an exception, were for a republican form of government, while the friends of the monarchical principle were mostly confined to the eastern states. So you see that as early as 1790, there was a great difference growing up between the leading statesmen of the North and South on the subject of government. Indeed, we may go back 3 years further and find these very parties existing in the convention that formed the Constitution. There we find what we may call the Jeffersonian and the Hamiltonian parties pitted against each other. The one in favor of a government of the people, with powers cautiously limited and clearly defined in the Constitution. The other in favor of what they called, quote, a strong government, unquote, with similar powers to a monarchy without its name. We have had that since March 9th, 1933 in America. We may say that the Jeffersonian idea was that the people are the masters of the government, while the Hamiltonian idea was that the government is the master of the people. The conflict between these opposing ideas caused all the debates in the Constitutional Convention. But finally, the Jeffersonian, or the anti-monarchical party, triumphed in the production of a democratic constitution. The great disappointment which this result gave to Mr. Hamilton may be seen in a letter which he wrote to Mr. Morris, February 27th, 1802, where he says, quote, mine is an old destiny. Perhaps no man in the United States has sacrificed or done more for the present Constitution than myself. And contrary to all my anticipations of its fate, as you know from the beginning, I am still laboring to prop the frail and worthless fabric. Yet I have the murmurs of its friends, no less than the curses of its foes, for my reward. What can I do better than withdraw from the scene? Every day proves to me more and more that this American world was not made for me, unquote. In the above extract, we find Mr. Hamilton characterizing the Constitution of his country as, quote, a frail and worthless fabric, unquote. Well, George W. Bush called it a GD piece of paper, and bitterly threatening to abandon his country forever. This was after the Constitution had been in operation 14 years. His experience had certainly been a very hard one for a man of his political principles. He was an avowed monarchist, but his countrymen had, notwithstanding his earnest labors to the contrary, established a democratic constitution. Failing, see, we had a democratic republic. We didn't have a democracy. We had a democratic republic. And we still do. We still have a democratic republic, but it's presently being occupied and has been occupied for 85 years by a temporary military government. Failing in getting his principles incorporated into the Constitution, he next tried, as a leading member of Washington's cabinet, to give a monarchical interpretation to a democratic constitution. This conduct on his part produced a murmur among the people and caused the letter of inquiry from Washington above referred to. His disheartened and peevish letter to Mr. Morris, from which I have given an extract above, was written 2 years after the election of Mr. Jefferson to the presidency, which event certainly seemed to give a finishing blow to the Hamiltonian ideas of government in the United States. His party had made a desperate effort to subvert the Constitution under the presidency of John Adams, which was terminated by the election of Jefferson in 1800. General Washington served his country as president 8 years when John Adams was elected to succeed him in that high office. During Washington's term, the Hamiltonians, who called themselves, quote, Federalists, unquote, and who embraced a great majority of the men of wealth and high social position in the northern states, were not permitted to make any visible headway in subverting the Constitution. The overshadowing popularity of Washington kept down everything like the ambition of cliques and sections. But no sooner was his presidency at an end than the quote-unquote Federalists, the enemies of the democratic principle of government, showed the cloven foot of monarchism again, and nearly every safeguard which the Constitution throws around the liberty of the people was disregarded and overthrown. Then it was that the antagonism between the political principles of the leading statesmen of the North and the South assumed a tolerably well-defined shape in the division of parties. Adams was originally a Democrat and had performed most valuable service to his country in the Revolution, which won the independence of the American colonies. In a letter to General Washington, dated Philadelphia, May 8, 1791, Mr. Jefferson thus feelingly alludes to Mr. Adams' apostasy. Quote, "I am afraid the indiscretion of a printer has committed me with my friend, Mr. Adams, for whom I have a cordial esteem, increased by long habits of concurrence in opinion in the days of his republicanism, and even since his apostasy to hereditary monarchy and nobility. Though we differ as friends," unquote. Remember George Washington, they wanted him to be a king. He refused to be king. Washington was no Federalist, he was no monarchist. He was essentially a Democratic Republican, and evidenced by his refusal to be a king. Going on. He says, again, Jefferson says, quote, "Mr. Adams had originally been a Republican." That's a Democrat. "The glare of royalty and nobility during his mission to England had made him believe their fascination to be a necessary ingredient in government. He was taken up by the monarchical Federalists in his absence, and on his return to the United States, he was by them made to believe that the general disposition of our citizens was favorable to monarchy." Unquote. Back in a moment.
This is 24/7 World Radio, and you're listening to The Eric John Phelps Show.
This is Brother Jack. I invite you to listen to my broadcast on 247worldradio.com. I preach the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ to the Polish-speaking people scattered around the whole world. Furthermore, I defend the Reformation in Poland, Polish Protestants and Baptists, and Polish Reformation Bible. I also expose the Counter-Reformation in my homeland, led by the Jesuits and by the Roman Catholic institution. Join me every Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on 247worldradio.com. Tu brat Jacek, zapraszam Was do wysłuchania mojej audycji na 247worldradio.com. Głoszę Ewangelium Pana Jezusa Chrystusa ludziom mówiącym po polsku rozproszonym po całym świecie. Ponadto bronię reformacji w Polsce, polskich protestantów i baptystów oraz polskiej Biblii reformacyjnej. Demaskuję również kontrreformację w mojej ojczyźnie kierowaną przez jezuitów i przez rzymskokatolicką instytucję. Dołącz do mnie w każdy czwartek o godzinie 17 czasu wschodnioamerykańskiego na 247worldradio.com.
This is Brother Nicholas. Join me every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the German Bible Truth Hour and at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the Dutch Bible Truth Hour on 24/7 World Radio. This is Bruder Nicholas. Ich lade euch herzlich ein, mich anzuhören jeder Dienstag um 2 Uhr nachmittags, amerikanische Zeit, für die deutsche Bibelwahrheitsstunde und 3 Uhr amerikanische Standardzeit für die niederländische Bibelwahrheitsstunde am World Radio 24/7. Dit is broeder Nico. U bent hartelijk uitgenodigd om elke dinsdag om 2 uur Amerikaanse standaardtijd het Duitse Bijbelwaarheidsuur te volgen en 3 uur Amerikaanse standaardtijd het Nederlandse Bijbelwaarheidsuur te volgen op 24/7 World Radio.
This is the Eric John Phelps Show on 24/7 World Radio.
With Eric John Phelps back with reading our wonderful book, A Youth's History of the Great Civil War, written in 1867. Continuing, and by the way, the Democratic Party today are the old Federalists wanting the president or commander-in-chief to have unlimited power as of a monarch, ruling the limited republic as it's a kingdom, as it's an empire. The Republican Party wants a limited monarch, ruling the republic as an empire yet, with the president as a monarch, but they want his monarchical powers limited. Both want the monarchy. Both want the empire. Neither are going to advocate the repeal of Proclamation 2040, or that the president issue a proclamation termination, and neither are going to repeal the Emergency Banking Relief Act that approves Proclamation 2040 and that brought the Trading with the Enemy Act inside this country concerning every domestic transaction. So they're not going to touch the Emergency Banking Relief Act. That's 12 United States Code 95A and B. And they're not going to call for the president to issue a termination proclamation. So, again, the Democratic Party is for unlimited monarchy. The Republican Party is for limited monarchy. And both are controlled by the Jesuits. Going on. Under Mr. Adams' administration, the most foolish and oppressive acts were passed by the Federalist majority of Congress, among them the infamous, quote, Alien and Sedition Laws, unquote, which gave the president power to banish all aliens from the United States or to lock them up in prison during his pleasure, also to cause the arrest and imprisonment of any person who should write or speak anything against the president or Congress. In a word, these acts endowed the president with the despotic powers. That's kind of like the NDAA, okay? Putting the liberty of every Democrat in the United States in jeopardy and producing a reign of cruelty and terror which lasted to the end of Mr. Adams' administration. As a specimen of the disposition of that administration, we will mention the case of the Honorable Matthew Lyon, Lyon, a Democrat and estimable citizen, who, for, quote, ridiculing the ridiculous or idle parade, unquote, of the president, was seized and thrust into a cold dungeon 6 feet square, where he was left freezing and starving for a whole winter, and his liberation then authorized only on condition of his paying a fine of $1,000. $1,000 in 1792 or thereabouts is like maybe 100,000 today. The Federalists everywhere ran riot in cruelty and mob violence. Sounds like the Democrats today. One of the most distinguished patriots of the United States, General Sumter, was brutally knocked down and beaten by one of the officers and spies of the administration at the theater in Philadelphia because he neglected to take off his hat when it was announced that the president was coming in. The Puritans didn't do that either. They didn't take off their hats. General Sumter was at this time an old man, as ripe with honors won in the service of his country as with years. But neither age nor virtue nor patriotism afforded any shield from the malice of the supporters of the king-aping president. As a specimen of the monarchical spirit of those times, we will give the following brief extract of a public address made to the president, dated Boston, May 1st, 1798. Quote, "We, the subscribers, inhabitants and citizens of Boston, in the state of Massachusetts, deeply impressed with the alarming situation of our country, beg leave to express to you, the chief magistrate and supreme ruler, in italics, over the United States, our fullest approbation of all the measures, external and internal, you have been pleased to adopt under direction of, quote, divine authority, unquote. It is proper to mention that the only alarming situation in our country, quote unquote, at that time was the natural and growing indignation of the people at the despotism of the party in power. The historian of these events, John Wood, says, quote, during the scenes of tyranny which were daily exhibited, the federal papers throughout the Union were filled with an address to the President, complimenting him upon his mildness and justice, the impartiality of his administration, his attachment to liberty, and his benevolence to foreigners, unquote. The author above quoted says in another place, quote, these factions admired John Adams because John Adams admired the British Constitution. Remember, Britain has no constitution. They just refer to it as some sort of invisible guideline. But England, Great Britain has no constitution. The British Constitution and cursed the French Republic. They bestowed unbounded panegyrics upon Alexander Hamilton for the same reason. They thought the administration and the government ought to be confounded and identified. That the administration was the government, and the government the administration, and that the people ought to bow in tame submission to its whims and caprices, unquote. It does not need one to come from the dead to tell you that during the last 5 years, we had a resurrection of the same party. That's from 1861 to 65, or to 1861 to 67, because they're writing it in 1867, this book here. We had a resurrection of the same party, which had lain in its grave ever since it was driven from power in 1800 by the election of Mr. Jefferson to the presidency. Its defeat and overthrow then was owing to the patriotism and decision of the united South under the lead of Jefferson and Madison. In opposition to all those unconstitutional and despotic acts of the Federalists, these patriots drew up the celebrated, quote, Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798, unquote, which were adopted by the legislatures of Kentucky and Virginia and accepted by the whole South, and with as much unanimity as they were condemned by the North. The resolutions are too long to quote here, but their substance may be given in a few words. They pointedly condemn all the revolutionary and despotic acts of the Adams administration as subversive of the free government of the United States, and clearly set forth all the powers of the federal government as resulting from a compact or agreement between independent and sovereign states, each state possessing, quote unquote, an equal right to decide, quote, for itself as well of infractions as of the mode and manner of redress, unquote. For itself as well as of infractions as of the mode and manner of redress, unquote. As one of these sets of resolutions was drawn by the very hand which wrote the Declaration of Independence. Remember, Jefferson was one of 5 authors of the Declaration of Independence. He was not the only author. And the other by that which wrote the Constitution of our country. There were other authors that participated, but James Madison penned the Constitution, and specifically the Bill of Rights, the Baptist James Madison. They were received by all the friends of free government as the utterance of the highest wisdom and patriotism. The monarchy aping Federalists raised a wild outcry of alarm, but the friends of democracy at once adopted the resolutions as their written creed. On the platform of these resolutions, Jefferson was elected president, and the Federalists hurled ignominiously from power. Thank God. No language can equal the violence and indecency of the vanquished Federalists. For defeating their plans of revolution, Jefferson was denounced as, quote, an infidel, a Jacobin, a traitor, and a scoundrel, quote unquote. These offensive epithets were hurled at the head of the patriotic author of our Declaration of Independence from pulpits, from the legislative halls of the northern states, and from the columns of every federal newspaper in the land, just as similar indecent jeers are now heaped upon the true followers of the great and good Jefferson by those who are trying to overthrow the democratic government made by our fathers. The hatred of Jefferson, as of all the leading statesmen of the South, which ranked in the bosoms of the discomfited Federalists, knew no bounds. It did not die with that generation. The parents taught their children to hate not only the name of Jefferson, but the whole Southern people. End of chapter 1. So we see this dialectic between Jefferson and Hamilton, between those who wanted a limited Republican government and those who wanted unlimited monarchical government. Chapter 2. The causes of the war continued. In continuation of the proofs that the enmity between the North and South, which resulted in the war, was laid at a very early period in the conflict of fundamental principles of government, we will summon again the testimony of Jefferson himself. In a letter dated 24th, 1796, addressed to this historian, Mazzei, M-A-Z-Z-E-I, and published in the Paris Moniteur, January 25th, 1798, Mr. Jefferson says, quote, "Our political situation is prodigiously changed since you left us. Instead of that noble love of liberty and that Republican government which carried us through the dangers of the war, an Anglo-monarchic aristocratic party has arisen." Folks, this is the foundation for the Pope's white Anglo-Saxon power structure. This is the beginning of it right here. Their avowed object is to impose upon us the substance, as they have already given us the form, of the British government. Nevertheless, the principal body of our citizens remain faithful to the Republican principles. I should give you a fever if I should name the apostates who have embraced these heresies, men who were Solomons in council and Samsons in conflict, but whose hair has been cut off by the Delilah of England. They would wrest from us that liberty which we have obtained by so much labor and peril, but we shall preserve it. Unquote. In another letter of a later date, Jefferson says, quote, "The alien and sedition laws are working hard. For my own part, I consider these laws merely as an experiment on the American mind to see how far it will bear an avowed violation of the Constitution. If this goes down, we shall immediately see another act of Congress attempt declaring that the President shall continue in office during life, reserving to another occasion the transfer of the succession to his heirs and the establishment of a Senate for life." And that is essentially what we have today. This is why there are several senators who've been in office for 4, 5, 6 terms. This severe language of Mr. Jefferson is fully borne out in a letter from John Langdon to Samuel Reingold, dated at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, October 10th, 1800, in which he says, quote, "In a conversation between Mr. Adams, Mr. Taylor, and myself, Mr. Adams certainly expressed a hope or expectation that his friend Giles would see the day when he would be convinced that the people of America would not be happy without an hereditary chief magistrate and senate, or at least for life." And we've had that for the last 85 years in this country. Now let us return and quote further from the letter of Jefferson. Quote, "A weighty minority of these Federalist leaders, considering the voluntary conversion of our government into a monarchy as too distant, if not too desperate, wish to break off from our Union its eastern fragment as being, in fact, the hotbed of American monarchism, with a view to the commencement of their favorite government, from whence other states may gangrene by degrees, and the whole thus by degrees be brought to the desired point." unquote. This is what we call today the liberal Eastern establishment. The liberal Eastern establishment is primarily Roman Catholic, and there are many Jews involved in it, and many apostate Protestants appear in the liberal Eastern establishment, and this is the font of the Pope's white power structure coupled to England and the monarchy of England today, overseen by the Jesuits of Georgetown, and the Jesuits oversee the monarchy there in England from London. This has been this way in this country since 1933 with Proclamation 2040 of FDR. Going on, this assertion of Mr. Jefferson is fully sustained by no less eminent an author than Matthew Carey, who in his celebrated work entitled, quote, The Olive Branch, in italics, gives a great many facts in relation to a conspiracy in New England to break up the Republic as early as 1796. He says, quote, a Northern Confederacy has been the object for a number of years. They have repeatedly advocated in public prints a separation of the states on account of pretended discordant views and interests of the different sections. This project of separation was formed shortly after the adoption of the federal Constitution. Whether it was ventured before the public, earlier than 1796, I know not, but of its promulgation that year there is most indubitable evidence. That means undoubtable, can't be refuted. To sow discord, jealousy, and hostility between different sections of the Union was the first grand step in their career in order to accomplish the favorite object of a separation of the states. For 18 years, therefore, i.e., from 1796 to 1814, the most unceasing endeavors have been used to poison the minds of the people of the eastern states towards and to alienate them from their fellow citizens of the southern states. Nothing can exceed the violence of these caricatures, some of which would have suited the ferocious inhabitants of New Zealand rather than a civilized and polished nation, unquote. Here you have proofs that the war upon the South was really begun by New England as early as 1796. In that year, an elaborate series of papers was published in Hartford, in the state of Connecticut, under the signature of quote-unquote Pelham, P-E-L-H-A-M. These papers, Mr. Carey tells us, were the joint production of men of the first talents in New England. The following extract from the first number of this Pelham series of essays fully justifies all that either Mr. Jefferson or Mr. Carey has said of the malcontents of New England. And remember, New England is now being filled with Roman Catholics and Anglicans, those who believe in monarchy, because the religion of a people always determined the government that it has. Quote, the northern states can subsist as a nation without any connection with the southern. It cannot be contested that if the southern states were possessed of the same political ideas, in italics, our union would be more close. But when it becomes a serious question whether we shall give up our government or part with the states south of the Potomac, no man north of that river, whose heart is not thoroughly democratic, in italics, can hesitate what decision to make, unquote. This, you must bear in mind, was written in 1796. It proves that the Republican or democratic principle of government, which was so tenaciously adhered to by the people of the South, was the cause of all the cunning hatred and abuse heaped upon them by the federal monarchy-loving leaders of New England. They deliberately proposed to destroy the Union then because the South was so, quote-unquote, thoroughly democratic, unquote. Incompatibility of, quote-unquote, political ideas was given as a sufficient reason for maligning the character of a whole people. Does that sound familiar? And for desiring to break up the Union, which had been established by the Constitution only 8 years before. As early as the above date, then, we must fix upon as the starting point of a political and social war upon the South, on the part of the Federalists in the eastern states, which went on gathering and increasing in intensity, increasing in intensity of estrangement and hatred until it ripened at last into the late terrible strife. There is a good maxim which tells us that, quote, continual dropping will wear a stone, unquote. If all the vile and all the false things which have been published in Northern papers and books for the last 70 years, or from 1796 to 1866, ostensibly against the South, but really to make democracy odious, were gathered into one work, it would make 100 volumes, such as big as a folio Bible. Is it not a wonder that the fatal conflict did not come before? The political peace, the moral peace, the social peace of this union was broken by the old Federal Party more than 70 years ago. But the complete triumph of the Democratic Party over that pernicious faction saved the country from an open rupture for the long period of 60 years. That's why the Jesuits had to break up the Democratic Party in the election of 1860. They broke up the Democratic Party. One part was in Charleston and the other part was in, I think it was Alabama. They had to break up the Democratic Party in 1860 to ensure a Lincoln victory. Going on, the hatred of the South, however, engendered by the old monarchist party of New England, could never be worked out of the anti-democratic portion of the Northern people. If the ground on which their hatred rested was worn away by time, or rendered no longer a decent excuse for opposition, their leaders were sure to hunt up some new issue on which to hang another chance of securing the end they had in view. Thus, when there no longer remained a chance or a hope of revolutionizing or changing the government of the United States into a form more congenial to the monarchical views of Hamilton and Adams, another excuse was sought for by which the cherished objects they had in view might be accomplished. After they could no longer make headway against the democracy of Jefferson, the old Hamilton party hunted round for some new issue on which they could rally and keep alive their waning partisan strength. They hit upon the Negro. Not that they had in their own hearts any peculiar love for him, or any objection to Negro subordination as it existed in this country. A great many of the leading men of their party had become rich out of quote-unquote the slave trade. That is, in bringing Negroes to these shores and selling them to the southern states. Negro subordination had existed also in every northern state, but the climate was so cold that the Negro was found to be unprofitable as a laborer, and so he was declared quote-unquote free. But no state did this for the reasons now given. Abolitionism or Negro equality as now understood did not exist among the federal leaders. The Negroes were quite universally looked upon as an inferior and helpless race, incapable of sustaining themselves as civilized beings, and as every other way better off under the institution of servitude as it existed in this country than they were in their own native Africa. There, they all are slaves to uncivilized heathen masters. They live upon snakes and worms and lead a life that is only just above that of the brute creation. Their lives also are entirely at the disposal of their barbarian masters. Sometimes as many as 3,000 or 4,000 of them are taken out one after another and butchered like so many pigs as a sacrifice to the Negro divinities. The most wretched Negro in the southern states was a great deal better off every way than he was in his own native country. All well-informed people know this to be true. Therefore, the great majority of good and intelligent men believe the institution of servitude in the southern states to be a real blessing. A comparison made between the Negro with a master and a Negro without one almost always resulted in favor of the former as the happier of the two. We shall stop here. We're almost to the end of Chapter 2 in A Used History of the Great Civil War, written in 1867. With Eric John Phelps, thank you for tuning in today. I have a book, Vatican Assassins. Please go to my website, vaticanassassins.org. For a gift of a certain amount, you will be sent other gifts. We're no longer having prices. This is not a business, it's a ministry. Send your gifts to RBT, P.O. Box 306, Newmanstown, Pennsylvania, 17073. That's RBT, P.O. Box 306, Newmanstown, Pennsylvania, 17073. And please pray for me for 120 seconds a day, 2 minutes a day, as I need desperately your effectual, fervent prayers. And please pray for our condition, the present condition of this country, because the Jesuits are moving in for the kill which they have planned from the days of the writing of this book in 1867. And may God send a great awakening. May the Lord give a peace to Jerusalem. May the Jews be secured in their land. May the Reformation continue. May the gospel continue to be preached. And may the Jesuit order may continue to be exposed as the trio culprits behind the world of woe, especially in this country we're experiencing today. And lastly, may the Lord bless you as you do his will, according to his word, the AV 1611 Reformation Bible. Lord willing, I'll be with you on Wednesday, February the 6th. Until then, Maranatha.
This is 24/7 World